I'm on a mission to beat 100 video games every year, and I just finished Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Let's talk about it. The original Final Fantasy VII released in 1997 when I was 13 years old, the perfect age to fall in love with what would come to be known as perhaps the greatest RPG of all time. But I didn't actually play it, aside from a few chocobo races at the Gold Saucer on a friend's save file. Even so, this title evokes a high degree of nostalgia in me because I watched multiple other people play it all the way through. So even though I didn't beat it until 2 years ago, I do have a deep-seated love affair with the wide range of characters in this iconic story that dates all the way back to my childhood. As someone who usually attempts to reject nostalgia on principle to avoid bias, I have to admit that the original game delivers that warm, cozy blanket of familiarity on a level that's not only rare for me, but in fact entirely unique. I simply don't feel this way about any other game ever, period. When Final Fantasy VII Remake finally came along in 2020, I, along with millions of others, learned firsthand how powerful this feeling of nostalgia can be, especially considering how adept Square Enix has become at wielding this power. They injected the perfect amount of fan service into what is otherwise a completely reimagined world. And every knowing glance from every beloved character shows plainly that the creators know exactly which heartstrings to tug on. But Remake, while gorgeous and well put together, was fairly tight in scope, much like the Midgar section of the original classic. This is where I'd like to start explaining, without spoiling anything, what it is specifically about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth that's so damn special. And maybe a couple things that aren't so special. The opening chapter of this epic adventure strikes a very similar tone to that of the 2020 remake. It's captivating, but fairly linear, and you're not introduced to many new mechanics or gameplay options. This section could easily have been added to the back end of that previous remake and been right at home. But then something magical happens. You're finally let loose upon the truly open world of Final Fantasy VII, and it is a childhood dream come to life. In stark contrast to the flat, angular plains of the original, the rolling grasslands beyond Midgar are overflowing with detail, and every hill you crest presents some reimagined version of flora or fauna that calls back to the 90s with a not too subtle wink. You can't look in any single direction without spotting some landmark of interest, whether it be an old forgotten lean-to or a distant fortress towering into the fog. Square Enix poured a lifetime of dedication into crafting a world that is so much more interesting than your standard cookie-cutter open-world formula game. And it doesn't hurt that they have a library of lore to pull from anytime they want to throw something fascinating into your way. And they don't stop with the overworld. They transform every tiny forgettable village in the original game into a glistening spectacle, and every corner of every alleyway demands your attention. This is a fitting metaphor for how they embellish and build upon the story in general. They'll take two throwaway lines about a minor tangent of the story and turn it into 2 hours of plot-critical gameplay, and the parts that were already a big deal are given a level of attention and care that is unrivaled by developers who are clearly as in love with this world as we are. The end product is a jaw-dropping manifestation of the collective dreams of millions of RPG lovers the world over. To be clear, I don't think the story is perfect, and we'll get to that in a second, but there's no denying that Square Enix has managed to capture the wonder of the original game and package it in a way that conveys their love of the source material, and their respect for our love as well. All of this would still be amazing without the nostalgia factor, but adding that to the equation turns everything up to 11. While I find the story and the open world to be the biggest highlights of the experience, the combat system is no slouch. Much like the storyline, they've taken the foundation of combat that was laid by the 2020 remake and improvised beautifully over it, adding a ton of complexity in the form of skill points, weapon upgrades, movesets, and more, without sacrificing any of the grace and simplicity that comes with active combat over the more traditional turn-based setup. It feels amazing to be lost in the heat of a tough battle, and then realize as the boss finally falls that you just executed 5 different moves, switching between 3 different characters in the last few seconds of the fight to secure the win. The game's not that hard, at least not at first, but it does do an excellent job of making you feel like a badass who just barely squeaked out a victory by pulling 3 last-second plays out of your ass as your HP drained down to 0. Now, since we're on the subject of combat, this is probably a good time to get into some of the critiques. But before we do, I'm just gonna push this button here. What does this do? Oh. Oh, weird. I didn't know I could do that. Do those words mean something to you? So anyway, I do have some minor nitpicks with this game, and maybe a couple major ones, starting with the bosses. Most of the boss fights are good or great, if maybe a little too easy from time to time. But Rebirth does suffer from an affliction that is unfortunately pretty common. Specifically, they don't seem to know how to make a really good, really hard boss battle. They know how to make them fun usually, and they know how to make them tough, as evidenced in the final act of the game when suddenly my death counter started putting in some real work. But usually I found them to be tough for the wrong reasons. A great boss battle that's really difficult is almost always good at showing the player why they lost. They don't usually rely on cheap one-shot kills or inescapable AoE attacks, and when they do put you on the ground, you know why you're lying there as long as you're paying a little bit of attention. I'm not going into spoiler territory, but let me just say that a few of the moves of some of the later bosses are dog shit. They will kill you in one swipe even if you're level 99 at full health, and the only way to avoid certain doom is to either kill them first, so you're in kind of a DPS check situation, or you just figured out somehow that you have to target this one specific part of the body that has nothing apparently to do with the move. Maybe I'm just stupid, but I've beaten a lot of bosses in a lot of games, and I've gotten pretty good at sniffing out weak points, telegraphed moves, vulnerabilities, etc. But I had to pull up a walkthrough a couple of different times just to figure out how to proceed without getting splattered all over the walls by these bastards in a single move. It might be a stretch to call it lazy or inflated difficulty, but my personal opinion is that it is not ideal game development. There were also some minor technical issues that will hopefully get a patch to address them soon. You may have heard that the performance mode inflicts a major penalty on the resolution, and this is true. If you want to play this game at 60 FPS, you are going to have to deal with a significant drop in the visual quality. It is rough. I almost wish I'd never seen it before I made the change, because I audibly gasped at the graphical downgrade when I changed the setting. I did eventually get used to it, but still, it is not pretty. There's also a weird audio issue where the music is just way too loud in some parts when the focus is on the dialogue. Like, so loud you can't really hear the characters speaking and you have to just read the subtitles. I know they're proud of the score they put together for this, but I also need to continue using my ears after I'm done here. They'll probably patch it soon, so I doubt there's much to worry about in the long term. The last problem I have with this amazing game is kind of a biggie. We talked at length earlier about how incredible the story is and how impressed I was with the modifications and additions they've thrown into the recipe. And all of that is true, but I'm afraid they also lost sight of a small part of what made the original plotline so singularly mesmerizing back when we first experienced it. One of the reasons it's hard for me to get into JRPGs is that the plot is often a jumbled mess that is impossible to understand without outside help. Look at the Kingdom Hearts series. I've never played those games, but I've heard many horror stories about how actually understanding what's going on at any given time is virtually unmanageable on your own. Again, without spoiling anything, I'm afraid Square Enix may have poured a little too much Kingdom Hearts syrup onto this Final Fantasy sundae, particularly in the final act. I was one of the proponents of the meta-narrative direction they decided to take with the remake, but Rebirth takes that idea and runs with it so far into the distance that there's no way intellectually you can hope to catch it. I don't mind things being abstract or even nonsensical. In fact, I like it when directors for games and movies strike a tone that implies that what we're seeing is more about the imagery and the metaphor than the actual substance of the plot. But the original Final Fantasy VII was special precisely because it wasn't like that. This was the most accessible a JRPG had ever been up to that point, and the story had intrinsic value for its beautiful narrative and well-realized characters, not for being complicated and convoluted for the sake of it like many other games of the genre. As I started to watch the credits roll after beating Rebirth, it dawned on me that I had just watched hours of cutscenes while simultaneously having no idea what was happening. Even after watching multiple explanation videos, I have at best a tenuous grip on what actually went down at the end. Overall, I loved the story that Final Fantasy Rebirth tells, even including all the new flourishes, except for the final few hours. Everything just goes right off a cliff and directly into the bin for me. But even considering all of that, at the end of the day, I absolutely adored playing through this game. So the last question I have to ask myself and you is this: is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth even better than the original? And the answer is, I think it depends. Were you the kind of person that was miffed that Square Enix decided to make serious changes to the storyline? Did you recoil in disgust when you discovered that they ditched the turn-based system for a new active combat format? If the answer to either of those questions is yes, you probably won't enjoy Rebirth as much as the original 97 classic. However, if you're like me and you are a fan of both of those things, and you place a high value on a more modern open world with lots of awesome things to do, then even considering the negatives we've gone over, there's a good chance you'll would prefer the remake, as I did. Now that's not to say that Rebirth is actually a better video game. It would probably be almost impossible to create a brand new game with the level of influence and impact that the original title boasts. But now we're wading into objective quality territory, and that's something that I don't believe is really possible to quantify. That said, I've ranked every video game I've beaten since the beginning of 2020 not by objective quality, since nobody can agree on what the hell that is, but rather based on how happy it made me personally, which I can always agree on. And out of the 24 games I've beaten so far in 2024, I ranked Final Fantasy Rebirth number 1, just ahead of God of War Ragnarok. Since I started doing this in 2020, I've now beaten a total of 471 video games, and I ranked this at number 5 all time, right in between Resident Evil 4 Remake and Outer Wilds. That spot firmly cements this as my favorite JRPG of all time, unless you count Souls-likes as JRPGs, but then what kind of person are you? Regardless, whatever kind of person you are, I hope you found something of use to you in this review, whether you're planning to sink dozens of hours into Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, or you just want to know what all the fuss is about. If you did enjoy it, a simple like really goes a long way, and you're welcome to subscribe if you want to see more videos on the newest releases, as well as daily short videos with rankings, memes, and mini reviews on every game I managed to beat, because if I didn't finish it, I don't believe I've earned the right to review it. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day.